Hey guys, this is a follow-up to my last video on the audio for Shattered Realms. Last time, I went through the overall scope, audio requirements, and how I started building the ambient and environmental sounds. For that video, it was mainly about the world around the player, while this one is about the player themselves. So this time, I wanted to get a bit more into the weeds and share how I approach the player sounds, the foley, abilities, voiceover, and how it all gets mixed together in Unreal Engine 5. So I think the player sound should be the most detailed sounds in the game because they're always front and center, highly repetitive, and bring important context to everything the player does. There's currently two characters in development, the Sorceress and the Berserker, and they're completely different from one another. The Sorceress is agile and adaptable, while the Berserker is heavy and relies on physical strength. The goal was to make the sound for each character feel like they're a part of the same world, sharing the same powers and ability types, while still being unique to their personality and fighting style. A good place to start on any game project is to experiment with the foley design and the character's core ability sounds. The Sorceress needed light, swift movement that still felt powerful in a busy mix, while the Berserker needed heavier movement that matches size and strength. As I covered in the last video, enemy and environmental sounds are mixed spatial cues, leaning on reverb and panning, so the player can tell where the sound is coming from. This leaves room for the player foley, which always sits center in the stereo field. For the Berserker, I got to experiment with heavy impacts, using different layers that trigger independently inside a MetaSounds source graph. The hammer swing and the attack vocalizations are separate sound sources on top of that. And all of this is placed on the animation blueprint, so each element syncs up with the animation. For the Sorceress, the focus was light and agile, which meant choosing source material with more high-frequency detail in her movement. Her attack is a quick cast animation, and for that, I was inspired by Hogwarts Legacy and their wand sound effects. I actually made a video breaking down the sound design for that game, which I'll add on the screen now. I wanted each one-shot to be heavily layered so that even though the movement is subtle, there's still a lot of power in the cast itself. You can think of everything in the foley section as the player acting, while in this section, this is when the player is reacting, triggered by the world instead of by the input. And here, I make a deliberate exception to a rule I set earlier. Player sounds normally sit center, but the hit indicators don't. They're actually directional because they're used as a damage cue. And I'm using them mainly as indicator sounds, so if you get hit from the left, you hear it from the left. So that means the sound should tell you where the threat is coming from before you process anything on screen. They also scale with the hit, so a big chunk of damage will feel heavier than a light graze. And you might be wondering why I went with impacts here rather than typical hurt vocalizations. Impacts are quick and responsive, and they stay out of the way when the player is getting hit constantly. Usually vocalizations are the obvious choice, but in a roguelite where you take hundreds of hits in a run, they get really repetitive, and they start to fight the rest of the mix. For the low health effects, indicating low health is more of a state than a one-shot, so I treat it differently. Instead of firing a sound, I'm running a change across the mix. It's an EQ notch filter effect on the master submix, which ramps with the player health percentage. On top of that mix change, I bring in a heartbeat loop. It fades in as the health drops, and then it speeds up and gets more intense the closer the player gets to death. And for this, I wanted the danger to feel like it's building, rather than just a single warning. All of these elements played together is what creates a real sense of urgency for the player. The player death is the one reactive sound that gets to be a single designed moment. There's an end screen that shows your stats for the run, so I wanted to make sure that all other game sounds are silenced, so you just hear the UI and music. I'm doing this with another mix state, using a control bus mix that fades these elements out. Reactions are the best way to make the combat feel like it has stakes. The player already knows what their own attacks sound like. It's hearing and locating the world hitting back that makes the fight feel dangerous. The next step was the core abilities for both characters, and these are unique to each character. Depending on what the player upgrades, they can lean into one elemental type, and all of these upgrades feed into a progression loop, which I'll come back to later. Starting with the Berserker, he has two core attack types, a standard attack called a slam, and a heavy attack called Elite. Each has its own set of elemental types and upgrades. They are layered on top of the foley impacts I designed earlier, which sells the heavy quality of the hammer, while still letting you hear the actual effect. The Sorceress also has 2 attack types, but they're very different. You saw the spellcast animation earlier, which drives most of her abilities, but she also has 4 elemental dash abilities that can be upgraded to deal damage. So starting with the spellcast, these shoot projectiles that inflict elemental damage. And just like the Berserker, these layer on top of the foley, and they're directional, attached to the projectiles. Each one has a cast sound, layered with a projectile loop, and then impact one-shots once it collides with an object or enemy. The dashes are part movement, part ability, and each elemental dash has its own cast and arrival variations. I'm using multiple layers in each MetaSound to have control over lots of variations, like high and low whooshes, tones, and tails. If you're interested to learn how I did this, here's a short video on how I've set this up. Okay, now we're moving on to the shared abilities. When the player levels up, they can stack extra abilities on top of their 2 main attacks. There's a lot of them, so instead of going through each one, let's break them down into different categories. From an audio perspective, they all answer the same 2 questions. Where does the sound live, and how long does it live for? Thinking about it this way means that every ability falls into one of these few patterns. Bible abilities are magic projectiles that orbit around the player, while auras are continuous damage over time zones. These are different abilities, but with the same architecture. A cast to start, a loop while active, and then an extinguish to close it out. These stay attached to the player with no directional panning. With the Bible types, the player can keep adding projectiles. So if each one carried its own audio instance, I'd burn voice count real fast for no real payoff. So I treat the whole ability as one centered sound instead of a swarm of emitters. You lose nothing perceptually, and the mix stays clean. Novas are the same shape as auras, a burst of area damage, but they fire a single one-shot rather than a loop. Anything that leaves the player and travels gets handled just like the core projectiles earlier. The sound attaches to the projectile and pans in 3D so you can hear where it's going. Fan of Blades, Phantom Blades, Ice Shards, and the Dragon's Breath all share a cast and an impact. Orb abilities like the Lightning Orb add a sustained loop with electric hit sounds when the enemy is inside. High level abilities like the Lightning Strike, Meteor Strike, Sunbeam, and Ice Comet all cast 3D sounds. The Sunbeam has a staged loop, an initial impact, followed by a loop, and then a cool-off extinguish sound. While the Meteor and Ice Comets have a loop attached to the projectile first, before impacting. And for the defensive abilities, they have their own pattern. I decided not to include an activation or loop sound for these, since I think they'll be drowned out in the mix, especially with all of the other abilities playing at once. A cleaner approach was to add an extra layer to the hit indicator sounds I showed earlier. This makes it feel like that the shields are absorbing the hits, which is exactly what it's used for. It also has a deactivate sound when the shield breaks, which acts as another warning indicator. Once I broke these sounds down into these different templates, it made the process of adding new ability sounds much easier. Once the cast, loop, extinguish, and projectile patches exist, a new ability is mostly a matter of swapping out the sound sets. If you're interested in learning more about setting up these patches using MetaSounds, I've made a blog that describes the process with actual examples from the game. The next thing that really adds to the gameplay is the voice lines.
If you overcharge me, I'm setting your counter on fire.
These trigger when the character both acts and reacts to the world, and it brings the whole experience together. There's voice lines for encounters,
A dragon of death. This will be a worthy fight.
upgrades,
A powerful relic, to be sure.
interactions,
This could be useful.
and important gameplay cues.
I must retreat, or I'll fall here.
For mixing these in with all of the other sounds, I've set these up so they sidechain other gameplay sounds by using a submix effect. I've grouped all of these sound types together so I can duck them with one sidechain compressor controlled by the player voiceover submix. All those abilities and elemental upgrades only matter because the player is constantly earning, choosing, and getting stronger. And that whole loop needs to feel good on its own. The Soul XP is probably the most repetitive sound in the entire game. The player collects it non-stop. Looking into the MetaSound, I pitched it up slightly as pickups chain together, so a big collection after clearing a wave reads as a satisfying rising run instead of the same blip over and over again.
Another step closer to mastery.
This is the payoff, so it gets to be the loud design moment that the soul pickups have been building toward. Where the pickup is tiny and repetitive, the level up is a single clear stinger that says you've earned this. And as soon as the XP reaches a new level, the level up screen appears with multiple upgrade options. The majority of these will just be common upgrades, but occasionally the player will receive uncommon or rare options, which have their own set of satisfying UI sounds. Once the player selects an option, the level up stinger plays synced with the visual effects. This one sits in a grey area between gameplay and UI, so I'll only touch it here and share the full UI sounds in a separate video. So that's the loop. Foley and interactions make moment-to-moment combat feel physical, the abilities give the player their power, and progression is what keeps pulling them back into it.
My strength surges.
The goal was to make sure that each sound helps reinforce that cycle, so that hopefully it's still fun to play after 100 runs. Thanks for watching this far, and if you want to go deeper on anything I covered, I put extra material down in the description. And if you're new here, the first video covers the world side of all of this, the ambient and environmental design. I'll put it on the screen now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.